Chapter 9 of the Enchanted Barn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 9. Quite early the next morning Sidney Graham was in his office at the telephone. He conferred with the carpenter, agreeing to meet him out at the barn and make final arrangements about the windows in a very short time. Then he called up the trolley company and the electric company and made arrangements with them to have a wire run from the road to his barn, with a very satisfactory agreement whereby he could pay them a certain sum for the use of as much light as he needed. This done, he called up an electrician and arranged that he should send some men out that morning to wire the barn. He hurried through his morning mail, giving his stenographer a free hand with answering some of the letters, and then speeded out to Glenside. 3 men were already there, 2 of them stonemasons, working away under the direction of the contractor. They had already begun working at the mass of stone around the windows, striking musical blows from a light scaffolding that made the old barn look as if it had suddenly waked up and gone to house cleaning. Sidney Graham surveyed it with satisfaction as he stopped his car by the roadside and got out. He did delight to have things done on time. He decided that if this contractor did well on the job, he would see that he got bigger things to do. He liked it that his work had been begun at once. The next car brought a quartet of carpenters, and before young Graham went back to the city a motor truck had arrived, loaded with lumber and window frames. It was all very fascinating to him, this new toy barn that had suddenly come into his possession, and he could hardly tear himself away from it and go back to business. One would not have supposed, perhaps, that it was so very necessary for him to do so either, seeing that he was already so well off that he really could have gotten along quite comfortably the rest of his life without any more money. But he was a conscientious young man who believed that no living being had a right to exist in idleness, and who had gone into business from a desire to do his best and keep up the honorable name of his father's firm. So, after he had given careful directions for the electric men when they should come, he rushed back to his office once more. The next 2 days were filled with delightful novelties. He spent much time flying from office to barn and back to the office again, and before evening of the second day he had decided that a telephone in the barn was an absolute necessity, at least while the work was going on. So he called up the telephone company and arranged that connection should be put in at once. That evening he wrote a short note to Miss Shirley Hollister, telling her that the partitions were under way and would soon be completed, and that in a few days he would send her the key so that she might begin to transport her belongings to the new home. The next morning, when Graham went out to the stone barn, he found that the front windows were in, and gave a very inviting appearance to the edifice, both outside and in. As Elizabeth had surmised, the big latticed windows opening inwards like casement doors seemed quite in keeping with the rough stone structure. Graham began to wonder why all barns did not affect this style of window, they were so entirely attractive. He was thoroughly convinced that the new tenants would not be likely to remember or notice the difference in the windows. He was sure he shouldn't have unless his attention had been called to them in some way. Of course the sills and sashes were rather new looking, but he gave orders that they should at once be painted an unobtrusive dark green, which would well accord with the mossy roof, and he trusted his particular young tenant would not think that he had done anything pointed in changing the windows. If she did, he would have to think up some excuse. But as he stood at the top of the grassy slope and looked about he noticed the great pile of stones under each window from the masonry that had been torn away to make room for the larger sashes, and an idea came to him. "Mr. Jones!" he called to the contractor who had just come over on the car to see how the work was progressing. "Wouldn't there be stones enough altogether from all the windows to build some kind of a rude chimney and fireplace?" he asked. Mr. Jones thought there would. There were stones enough down in the meadow to piece out with in case they needed more, anyway. Where would Mr. Graham want the fireplace? Directly opposite the front doors? He had thought of suggesting that himself, but didn't know as Mr. Graham wanted to go to any more expense. "By all means make that fireplace," said the young owner delightedly. "This is going to be a jolly place when it gets done, isn't it? I declare I don't know but I'd like to come out here and live." "It would make a fine old house, sir," said the contractor respectfully, looking up almost reverently at the barn.
I'd like to see it with verandas and more winders, and a few such. You don't see many of these here old stone buildings around now. They knew how to build 'em substantial in those old times, so they did." Yes. It would make a fine site for a house, wouldn't it?" said the young man, looking about thoughtfully. "Well, now, we'll have to think about that sometime, perhaps. However, I think it looks very nice for the present." And he walked about looking at the improvements with great satisfaction. At each end of the barn a good room, long and narrow, had been partitioned off, each of which by use of a curtain would make two very large rooms, and yet the main section of the floor looked as large as ever. A simple stairway of plain boards had been constructed a little to one side of the middle toward the back, going up to the loft, which had been made safe for the children by a plain, rude railing consisting of a few uprights with strips across. The darkening slats at the small windows in the loft had been torn away and shutters substituted that would open wide and let in air and light. Rough spots in the floor had been mended, and around the great place, both upstairs and down, and even down in the basement underneath, electric wires ran with simple lights and switches conveniently arranged, so that if it became desirable the whole place could be made a blaze of light. The young man did not like to think of this family of unprotected women and children coming out into the country without all the arrangements possible to make them feel safe. For this reason also he had established the telephone. He had talked it over with the agent, paying a certain sum for its installation, and had a telephone put in that they could pay for whenever they desired to use it. This would make the young householder feel more comfortable about leaving her mother out in the country all day, and also prevent her pride from being hurt. The telephone was there. She need not use it unless necessity arose. He felt he could explain that to her. If she didn't like it, of course, she could have it taken away. There were a lot more things he would like to do to make the place more habitable, but he did not dare. Sometimes even now his conscience troubled him. What did he know about these people anyway? And what kind of a flighty youth was he becoming, that he let a strange girl's appealing face drive him to such lengths as he was going now? Telephone and electric lights and stairs and a fireplace in a barn. It was all perfectly preposterous, and if his family should hear of it he would never hear the last of it, that he was certain. At such times he would hunt up his young sister and carry her off for a long drive in the car, always ending up at Glenside Road, where she exclaimed and praised to his heart's satisfaction, and gave anew her word not to tell anybody a thing about it until he was ready. Indeed, Elizabeth was wild with delight. She wanted to hunt up some of her mother's old Turkish rugs that were put away in dark closets, to decorate the walls with pictures and bric-a-brac from her own room, and to smother the place in flowering shrubs for the arrival of the tenants, but her brother firmly forbade anything more being done. He waited with fear and trembling for the time when the clear-eyed young tenant should look upon the changes he had already made, for something told him she would not stand charity, and there was a point beyond which he must not go if he wished ever to see her again. At last one morning he ventured to call her up on the telephone at her office. "My sister and I were thinking of going out to see how things are progressing at the Glenside place," he said after he had explained who he was. "I was wondering if you would care to come along and look things over. What time do you get through at your office this afternoon?" "That is very kind of you, Mr. Graham," said Shirley, "but I'm afraid that won't be possible. I'm not usually done until 5:30. I might get through by 5, but not much sooner, and that would be too late for you." "Not at all, Miss Hollister. That would be a very agreeable time. I have matters that will keep me here quite late tonight, and that will be just right for me. Shall I call for you then at 5? Or is that too soon?" "Oh, no, I can be ready by then, I'm sure," said Shirley with suppressed excitement. "You are very kind." "Not at all. It will be a pleasure," came the answer. "Then I will call at your office at 5." And the receiver clicked at the other end, leaving Shirley in a whirl of doubt and joy. How perfectly delightful! And yet, ought she to go? Would mother think it was all right? His little sister was going, but was it quite right for her to accept this much attention, even in a business way? It wasn't at all customary or necessary, and both he and she knew it. He was just doing it to be nice. And then there was mother. She must send a message somehow, or mother would be frightened when she did not come home at her usual time. She finally succeeded in getting Carol at her school, and told her to tell mother she was kept late and might not be home till after 7. Then she flew at her work to get it out of the way before 5 o'clock.
But when she came down at the appointed time she found Carol sitting excitedly in the back seat with Elizabeth, fairly bursting with the double pleasure of the ride and of surprising her sister.